Wildlife Fund for Nature, WWF. And we've been working closely together on this topic. And as well, Natalie Interstel, who together we had a chance to work on this topic a little bit in Italy earlier this year. Natalie's the president of the Talanoa Institute in Brazil, and congrats and thanks for being here. Our speaker today, who's going to kick this all off, we're so lucky to have Monica Medina, the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, and Special Envoy for Biodiversity and Water Resources. What a great connection, right? So global oceans, that global dimension, and we were talking about it, but then that intersection with biodiversity and what does it mean and how does it connect to security. Monica, thank you for being with us here today. Please join me in giving Monica a round of applause to welcome her, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's really a pleasure to be here with CAP, with the GEF, and IISD to, oops, sorry about that. I'm sorry about the feedback. It's really great to be here this morning with everyone to talk about this important topic. It's one that's near and dear to my heart. It's been sort of at the heart of my career, my entire career, and I did start out actually in the US military, and then I spent another stint working in the Defense Department for Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. So for me, this comes as sort of second nature. Security and nature are really intertwined. Climate, security, and nature especially are intertwined. And we know we are facing huge crises today, and I'm proud to say that the Biden administration is working very, very hard to try to address them. And we know, many of us in this room, that we need greater action on climate. We know that we have, for many years, been calling for this. And we also know that nature needs solutions and offers solutions as well. It's a wonderful thing when you realize nature, Secretary Kerry said the other day, Mother Nature is shaking us, but she also has the power to help save us. And so it's a really important moment for us to be thinking about, talking about nature and nature-based solutions. Taking a step back, let's think about what we're up against. The impacts of climate are all around us, and in the last few months alone, we've seen record-breaking and life-threatening floods and droughts and heat waves and storms. The categories, the parade of horribles isn't hard to find. It doesn't take a lot of looking, and it reaches every corner of the earth, and all taking place against the backdrop of a global pandemic that cost millions of lives, and also now we're dealing with Russian aggression in Ukraine that has thrown up into uncertainty the international, the global landscape on how we were making the energy transition. But it's great to see how many countries in Europe who are faced with this crisis most directly are continuing to pledge that this, whatever small interruption that's caused, will continue. They will continue to make the transition, and in fact, it's accelerating it. So within the context of environmental threats, we see that there are feedback loops. These things are all related. They drive the compound risks to our economies and to food supplies, water supplies. They deepen the vulnerabilities of the most vulnerable communities, and they therefore are the breeding ground, the place where the most potential threats lay, whether it's zoonotic spillover or a militant insurgency that threatens endangered species, or water supplies that are being really, literally up for grabs, and people taking as much as they can for fear that they won't have enough. And what happens in that cycle of feedback loops of desperation that gets worse and worse is that we get closer and closer to conflict, and we destabilize institutions that have been sort of the pillars of maintaining global security for a long, long time. So it's interesting this time that we're in now, where the threats that we may have faced in the 20th century at the end are now completely different than the ones that are really existential threats for us now. We still have, yes, obviously the threat of aggressive land grabs like the one we've seen in Ukraine, but really all over the world, we face together the threat of climate change and loss of biodiversity and nature. And so ignoring the looming threat everywhere is, we do that at our peril. And no country can afford to be blind to these threats or to push them off into the future. And it is interesting because the consciousness, especially in America, is becoming much greater about climate change. And it's hard for people who denied climate for so long, I think, to appreciate it. But people are coming around, having seen all of the fires and floods and all the disaster, the many billion-dollar disasters year after year after year in the last decade, the extreme heat year after year after year. We now know that we have to overcome our disbelief. We have to push off the sense that it will get better and really actually address the climate crisis and the nature crisis full on. And it is time, it's high time for everyone really to start believing. And I think the most interesting thing I'm seeing is that even at a COP, we have communities of interest here that we hadn't seen even 4 or 5 years ago. Corporate community, farmers, people who really may not have been fully behind the climate crisis and understanding their part in it are now understanding it better and better and better. That doesn't mean we can let up. We need to keep going. But I think the U.S. government, what I can speak to most personally is that the U.S. government is really engaged now with, we've strengthened both our domestic ambition and our global ambition, and we strive especially to do more in the area of adaptation and prediction and early warning systems. We have a huge program called Prepare, and it's aimed at helping 500 million people to adapt and manage the impacts of climate change on their lives and livelihoods by the end of this decade. And so we've set a big ambitious goal for ourselves, 500 million people, to be better prepared for the climate security threat all around the world. And I'm pleased to say that we're increasing our work on early warning systems for all, which is a key pillar, I think a key way, and the Secretary General of the UN is so right on in demanding that all of us aim for early warning for all by 2025, because I do think one way that you can avoid disaster, which leads to insecurity, is by giving people the information they need in the places where they need it the most in order to be able to adapt and prepare for climate risks and stresses and nature and biodiversity risks and stresses. So I think we should, take a minute and also think about all the ways that this does impact our security, which I know is the key focus of this panel. And it's so wonderful to see these two areas tied together. Earlier this year, the White House launched its first global water security action plan, which I'm very pleased to be able to represent now in this role as an envoy on nature and biodiversity and water supply or water resources. And we're hoping that it will help us to focus our attention on the growing number of global hotspots for water and water-related conflict. We also have rolled out a national security memorandum on tackling illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which is a threat to health and security in the ocean worldwide. And we are raising our ambition to end wildlife trafficking and other nature crimes through an interagency task force and a new nature crimes alliance with countries worldwide. So we have an IUU Fishing Action Alliance and we have a Nature Crimes Alliance. So we are trying to increase the power of multilateral organizations, multilateral groups in fighting these really terrible scourges on our planet that cause insecurity everywhere, that take away the very fundamental basics in society that people need in order to have quality of life and to be able to make a living. And we are especially committed as well to conservation of nature and restoration of nature. And last April, President Biden signed an executive order to strengthen America's forests and combat global deforestation and to integrate all these issues into U.S. diplomacy. And we're all in on conserving 30% of the planet globally, lands and oceans, all waters, by 2030. And I've heard firsthand from President Biden that advancing these issues is a key commitment that he has personally decided on. I can tell you from the very beginning, all the way back into the presidential campaign in 2020, he was very moved by this issue and really wanted to put the full force of the administration behind it, because we know that addressing these threats will help us not only have better quality of life, better jobs and better job security. Believe it or not, many, many, many jobs depend on nature, and people don't really think of it that way. And again, obviously, it is the underpinning for our very own, the foundations of our very global security. So I think looking ahead, one of the things that we need to do is to continue to build this partnership and coordinate between NGOs like IISD and CAP and think tanks where the very kind of security work that is sort of at the forefront of thinking about our next security challenges is happening. These are not communities that have worked together traditionally, but we need them to work together now more than ever. And I know there's been a reluctance to see environment as part of the security sort of remit. Is it really part of what they're supposed to do in those security agencies? And the answer is a full-throated yes, because that's how we keep the world safe. At the same time, the environmental community is a little worried, oh, are we militarizing this? Are we turning it into a war? The answer is no. We are already needing to step up and work with the very, parts of our governments and institutions that deal with these kinds of threats all the time. I think there is a growing recognition that there are real risks that are at the scale of, a war that we're facing, right? I mean, climate change, if you look at any of the places that have been devastated, from Pakistan to Australia to the United States, Europe and the heat waves, we know that we are fighting a really enormous battle with Mother Nature right now, and we have to get her on our side. And so I actually want to end with one last thought, which is there have been people who have been defending the environment for a long, long time, who have been often at the have been seen as enemies of government, have seen as protesters, as people who are a threat to government. And I really want to put a fine point on that. People who have been defending the environment and who are championing the rights of those who are most impacted by environmental threats deserve our protection and our support now more than ever. And I think we're all waking up to the fact that the climate crisis is affecting all of us, not just frontline communities anymore, but they are at the pointy end of that spear of climate change and nature and biodiversity loss. So actually thinking about protecting them first, protecting the most vulnerable first, should be what defenders and what security is all about. So to me, these things, whether they were ever separated, they are now integrated, fully intertwined. Climate change is a threat multiplier. So is nature and biodiversity loss. I want to do a little shout out to Sherry Goodman, if she's here, wherever she is, the person who really helped to put these two communities, to start getting them talking, and to get the military to take climate change seriously as a threat, and to create that bridge with the environmental community. To Sherry and to everyone else who's worked on building that bridge, hats off to you, to environmental defenders who defended these communities before anyone else saw them as really a threat to security overall. I want to, tip my hat to them and just say, this is the beginning of this challenge. It is not going away. What we see now is what's baked in and what we will have to deal with. And so thinking about adapting our institutions to be able to deal with these challenges, to make us more resilient in the long run, to make us safer in the long run is really what this is all about. And I think this discussion is a great way to continue to build that bridge between these two communities and create the case for them working together more and more closely in the future. So thank you very much for the chance to kick you off today. I can't wait for the discussion.
Thank you, Monica. Maybe moderators aren't supposed to applaud, but I'm glad we broke out in spontaneous applause, because that was just really fantastic. And yeah, Alice and Natalie and others, we've been working on these sets of ideas over the past year. I mean, you summarized the issues masterfully, so there's so many ways we could go. And I have to say, it's exciting. It seems strange to talk about threats as being exciting, but when I hear about investments that are going to better protect people and protect nature, I think that's very exciting. Maybe just to start to get into this. So you said up front that people are starting to realize climate broadly as a security threat, because we're seeing the link to migration and the kinds of things that are the pictures on the television news and what's happening. What I was really interesting too to hear you say is that there is an increasing recognition too about the link not just to climate but to nature. So zoonotic spillover for disease, pandemic, obviously. But you also mentioned fish stock degradation, right? So that we have this link to nature. Nature's valuable in its own right, but we have this link to nature that has a real impact on human security. So the question I want to say is, this evolving conceptualization of security is more than, nature effects are kind of agents. They're described as actorless threats, right? They're not agents who are actively seeking to harm us. But that means they're different kinds of threats from a security perspective. So what does this new definition of security mean for the security agenda for the future and how we assess risks and threats to people and societies? You've already touched on this a little bit in terms of some of the early warning, but is there anything else you can say, if you even look like 10 years out? What does this mean for the future of the way we think about security? And then I'll ask other panelists to comment on that. But Monica, if you want to start.
Sure. I think what it means is that humanitarian assistance and the kinds of law enforcement, what I see actually as sort of the biggest disconnect is that we think of global law enforcement as sort of this patchwork instead of sort of the way that militaries now work so closely together. And I think we really need to up our game on the sort of global criminal networks, like with IUU fishing or with wildlife trafficking, which are so destabilizing in so many communities around the world, but it's diffuse, and these networks are intertwined with the drug dealers and drug lords and the people who are trafficking in humans. This global criminal syndicates are huge, and we need to figure out a way to actually come together the way our militaries have cooperated in the past to up our game on law enforcement. I think that's one thing. And the second thing is this humanitarian assistance sort of element that, or activity that our militaries have increasingly been engaged in, at least in our country and some of the more developed countries. I think we need to help them. We need to be prepared to help them wherever disaster strikes, and that's we can't just leave it to humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross. We need to bring in even bigger capabilities, hospital ships, or things like, with the Ebola crisis in Africa in 2014, the way that we assembled a whole of government approach in the U.S. to bring an entire, suite of capabilities, the military airlifted hospitals, and we were able to get on the ground quickly and actually, I think, really stave off a much, much worse disaster. I think that's the way we need to be thinking about this. We have an agency called FEMA in the U.S., and it responds to disasters quickly when they happen. And we need something akin to that globally so that we can respond to disasters quickly globally. And the last thing is early warning. Our weather service in the US saves billions of dollars every year and countless lives because they can warn people. And if we can warn people and in fact give them enough advance warning that we can adapt better, especially as we are building back after this pandemic, we will put ourselves in a much, much better spot.
Thanks so much, Monica. And yeah, just on one of your points on disaster response, I've heard that from military leaders, that in terms of their own planning even, they're not thinking about just climate and nature as a threat that leads to more conflict, but in terms of planning their workforce, how troops will be deployed. Let me open it up to the panelists, and I'm a little bit of a free flow moderator, so I'll just see who wants to start first. How else has this, how has the conceptualization of security changed when we start to think about nature? And Monica's mentioned some things that have changed, but I suspect some of you might also have the view that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, that there might be some preventative things we need to do up front. So Natalie, I see you grabbing the mic. Do you want to start?
Okay.
It's on.
It's on? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't grab the mic. I was like voluntarily. That's, oh, what should, okay. I think it's working now. Yeah, thank you, Monica. I think you mentioned several things that called my attention, and I want to start by saying that it's important that we somehow separate the climate and the nature dimensions. Of course, they are intertwined. We are dealing with both crises, but there's something about harming nature becoming a systemic risk to the levels. Oh, sorry, maybe. Okay. I think I'm back. So harming nature as a systemic risk is something that we are witnessing at the level of planetary boundaries being broke up, right? And in some cases, like in the Amazon rainforest, and I'm going to speak about that because it's closer to it's dear to my heart and close to my work. But in this case, what we are seeing is really the risk of a reversible collapse. So we're quite near a tipping point. And I think that brings, that really adds a very different dimension to the levels of, and the types of security threats that we will have to deal with. So just a few things that I would like to add to that. In the case of the Amazon, until the 80s, we had only 1% of the forest loss. Nowadays, it's about 20, and the science says that if we cross 25% of accumulated deforestation, we are going to enter in this dieback process. So we, of course, want to avoid that. But at the same time, this is very much coupled with the criminal networks that Monica just mentioned. So it's not only an environmental loss, of course. This is coupled with gangs, with militias, with people that are involved in different types of traffic, wildlife, arms, drugs. So this is all there. So it's not about just environmental agencies and ministries that are going to do the work. We know in the past it's worked. Brazil reduced 80% of deforestation in about 8 years, but now the situation is so dramatically different that we know it's not going to work. So what I mean by that, and I think it's important to also provide some data, is that we have to really build a new foundation for tackling these problems. There is the systemic issue, which is the tipping point. Then there are the very local and specific threats that need to be treated. And just to give you then the number, if the Amazon rainforest or the Amazon region in Brazil were a country nowadays, it would have the 4th highest rate of homicides in the world in relative terms, only behind El Salvador, Venezuela, and Honduras. So it's really about, the loss of the forest as a violence to nature, and at the same time, the violence against those that are trying to protect the forest, to leave it as it is. So anyhow, it's a very sad description, I know, but this is really what we are having to deal with. And I really don't like to use military words to describe things, but in this case, we've been saying that there is a war in nature, and this is deliberately promoted by some people, which are backed by politicians. So it's really a systemic problem, a systemic risk, and we need everybody at the front working together so that we can really reverse the problems, reverse the tipping points, and avoid the worst case scenarios.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I think Monica, you mentioned, you really stated the case very well. Of course, I know I can talk about Africa, where I come from. I mean, you look at the Congo Basin, you look at Lake Chad, you look at the Great Lakes region, you look at the Southwestern Indian Ocean. What do they have in common? They are havens for biodiversity, havens for natural resources that we depend on, but also areas that are very fragile, that are attacked by insecurity. So for us, we see the relationship between nature and insecurity playing out very clearly. And in addition to that, people are depending on these areas. You know, 30% of countries in Africa are affected by conflict. And this is resulting to 2.5 lower annual growth relative to no conflict scenario. Cumulatively, Africa is losing 15% of its GDP every year due to conflict. And of course, conflict is also linked to the loss of socioeconomic opportunities. When you look at the migrants bordering the boats to the Mediterranean, they're all looking for jobs. But in the Sahel, where you see a lot of this happening, 85% of recruits to popular terrorist organizations have finished secondary school with low access to income and opportunities. We have cases of Al-Shabaab said to generate over 380 million every year from illicit charcoal trade. So for us, the relationship between nature and security is very high. And it poses a threat especially to indigenous people and local communities who live near these resources for years and are dependent on them for their livelihood and also for their culture. I mean, I could also talk about illicit financial flows and IUU costing us over 200 billion a year. And it's important for exactly the same reasons you're talking about. For us, it's that whole link between nature, people, our resources, our economies. We have to deal with this in a manner that it tackles it together in a whole of government approach. And really the biggest challenge that we are seeing all the time is governance. We need to sort out the governance program. If local and national institutions lack the capacity to resolve the issues of our natural resources, or there's no benefit sharing and there's elite capture, there's no strong legislation being undermined by corruption and weak enforcement, we need to deal with the issue of governance. And for us, the issue of governance is going to be important. A top priority for us as WWF is exactly supporting these governments and the local communities and indigenous people to put in place these proper governance and incentives for better enforcement. It's a challenging space, of course, but working together, all of us here, we can definitely do something. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alice. Chiz, before I go to you, maybe I'll just add a question if you want to speak to this topic, but then to kind of relate it. First off, let's be clear about what we're talking about here. We all, a common criticism is that we're instrumentalizing nature, right? We're talking about it as how it supports people. And we realize nature has value in its own right? But what we're trying to say is the case hasn't been fully understood for how fundamentally important nature is for people. As Natalie said, we've started this war on nature. We need to reverse it. So Chiz, as you think about the topics that have been discussed, but you know the GEF, at which you work, is the largest source of multilateral funding for biodiversity globally. So any thoughts you can think about how the GEF is thinking about this investment in nature for security and conflict prevention, kind of that intersection. So over to you.
All right, thank you so much for the tall order right up to that starting. So before I get into the particular question of what the GEF is doing, I just wanted to highlight very quickly, before even I came to the GEF, I spent several years doing post-conflict assistance for Iraq, right? And what the issue that we were trying to address in Iraq was that the former regime basically drained the marshes of Mesopotamia to basically persecute, if you will, the opposition, take away their livelihoods, their jobs, their land, their lakes, everything. And that's a means of actually inflicting as much damage on their own people
And so this whole notion of threat multiplier as well as using nature as a weapon, as a war, I think there is already a pretty long history. It's just not being reported in that way. So after the fall of the last regime and what's called the post-conflict period, which I have to say wasn't actually post-conflict, it was active conflict for quite a bit of time, what we did was really go in and try to rehabilitate and restore water resources, even from the perspective of quality and quantity. How can you put water back into the marshes from the river water resources from Tigris and Euphrates rivers, right? So if you can actually put water back into the marshes, rehabilitate the ecosystems, start providing drinking water, have means of jobs and sustenance for the communities. These people who were forcibly displaced from their villages and what have you could actually go back, try to reclaim part of their culture, their livelihoods, and so on and so forth. So I think, in a way, there are ways to look at nature, ecosystems, even climate in this context, as threat multipliers, but having preventative measures to address them can really reduce the threat that the global community is facing. One more thing, those can also be used, in my opinion, as peace multipliers. I mean, if you want to stop this, we can do preventative measures, but at the same time, what are you going to offer to these communities, people who don't have a lot of options because the ecosystems are being degraded? They're not getting the opportunities to really stay in their own lands, to have meaningful as well as productive livelihoods. You're gonna have to really support ecosystems, biodiversity systems, providing opportunities to make sure they can make good livelihoods out of fisheries, subsistence agriculture, so on and so forth. So those are the elements through which, and I'm going to come to your question, the GEF stands, because we're talking about food security, we're talking about water security, we're talking about securities associated with sea level rise, threatening communities, illegal trafficking of wildlife, reduced resilience of communities. These are all anchored. They can be anchored into interventions that we can do in a systemic way through addressing food security. How do you address sustainable forestry? What are the climate adaptation actions that can help these communities? What are the land degradation as well as measures to combat desertification? They all, at the end of the day, manifest as options to help communities to stay there, thrive, protect their nature. So I think there's an element of the peace multiplier as well as reducing the threats through the interventions that GF can support. Very modest support, but with partnership with a lot of institutions as well as individuals here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Chiz. It's always just so great to hear your firsthand experience. No, really, thank you so much. Look, maybe let's go back, because we've actually touched on quite a few examples. We've painted a bit of a picture where there is this linkage between nature degradation as well as nature for peace building, right? We've talked about zoonotic threats and about fish. Can we talk about, so if the opportunity is there and organizations like the GEF see the opportunity, what can we do to better strengthen the relationship or the understanding of this linkage? So the relationship between, to put it bluntly, the nature and security communities. Now, some of us on this panel have started those conversations. Well, I guess all of us have. It's working with different NGOs. But can I just open it up? What opportunities do you see in strengthening that relationship between the nature and security community to get more attention, more resources, more understanding and action on this interlinkage? I don't know who'd like to start. Monica, I see you nodding. I think I might go to you first.
Well, I think it helps when the president understands the connection. As the commander-in-chief, when he makes the point that nature matters, it does really help. I also think it helps when military and particularly security and diplomats in governments see peace breaking out when nature conflict is resolved. And that's something that I hope we can build more examples of. There's a project that we're doing here in this region called Project Prosperity. And I think it's helping to build bridges between countries that hadn't really been willing to be partners before, and they're trading energy and water back and forth across borders that used to be fences and walls. So I do believe that there is hope for using diplomacy and the best technologies and our innovative efforts, things like early warning systems, can help places prepare for climate, as I said before. And when you see those results, when the security agencies see the results that environmental security, that nature security can bring, they come to the table. Anybody else?
You don't want to say? I think, no, thank you very much for that. I think there's also opportunities at the domestic level, I think, in terms of governments. I remember years ago my job used to be to mainstream environment into sectors, all sectors and plans of government, the first job, long ago. And I remember, of course, it was very difficult because at the time the environment was only supposed to be done by the Ministry of Environment or the National Environment Management Authority. But I remember we carried out a public environmental expenditure review to show all the different sectors of government that they have a role to play. And interestingly, the Ministry of Defense had the biggest contribution in their resources because they managed land. They had a lot of land and they needed protected because they needed. So we were able to show that actually you are contributing to this sector and we need you at the table. I think there's a lot to be done around policy coherence also at the national level, so that this doesn't always look like it's coming from somewhere else, but actually that we ourselves are recognizing this, that policy coherence is extremely important, bringing this Ministry of Defense at the table. We're seeing good examples. Rwanda recently, the Rwanda Defense College had a climate summit where they invited some of us to come and talk to the military about climate change. And I think there's more and more recognition that if they don't, because if the rangers that are being killed in the Virunga National Park are killed by armed militia, right? If we do not do something about protecting that, we know, then how can we be a solution, our work be a solution for the military? If the more work the more we can work together, the more we can protect nature, it becomes less of a, because it is a military issue as well. So I think there's work to be done there into making those linkages, but in also partnering with them.
Thank you. Very quickly, I think the point Monica raised about early warning as well as really understanding climate information, that's a very important one. At the end of the day, I think we need, as the environmental community, if we can call ourselves as that, need to understand the language, the indicators, what does it mean from the security community as to the addressing the global or national security issues, and be able to tailor our messaging as well as indicators, as well as the way the environmental threats as well as opportunities could be conveyed. I think that really needs to be much better understood and much better articulated. And sometimes I feel like we're using the same words but meaning something entirely differently, or we're using different words to mean the same thing from different communities. So having clear understanding of definitions, indicators, how we end up sort of being able to communicate based on quantifiable targets, numbers, what that means. And going back to the whole issue of early warning as well as climate information systems, I do think in terms of early warning, giving signals on the emerging threats, so to speak, those I think are the very good entry points for our community to be able to really convey the threats in a much more concrete and comparable way. Thanks.
Great points. Thanks, Shazian. Go over to Natalie. Natalie, because I was thinking of you when Monica mentioned new command, the commander-in-chief, and you've got a new commander-in-chief, so maybe you've got some thoughts on that.
I was super glad to hear that, Monica. Thank you. No, just on this issue, on the opportunities, I really see the nexus between nature and security and this agenda that's being put forward now as an opportunity to educate the armed forces, the military, about the rights-based approach to protecting nature as well. In some contexts, I don't know if in all, but in some, the military for a long time has seen like the indigenous peoples or those who have rights to nature as a threat. And they have been in conflict and sometimes, you know, really seeing that recognition of rights would be an international security threat. And I think there is now an opportunity to somehow educate, to find common language, to build a shared understanding, common indicators. Of course, that will require a lot of openness from both sides, I would say. But there is a window of opportunity here. And with regards to the leadership, of course, that's absolutely important. We've seen in the US, now in Brazil, we are very excited about having not having anymore a leader which declared a war on nature. We've seen through discourse, through, you know, decisions, how harmful that is, how harmful is when you have a president that stimulates land grabbing, stimulates illegal mining. So of course now we want to flip this page, consign this to the history, and really restart everything basically. And I think the military also will have a very important role to play in this new chapter of Brazil history, because they've been involved in things that didn't work. So we spent a lot of money in the past years using the military to do command and control, to do law enforcement, but they are not capable, not competent to do that. They need to be part of a larger ecosystem that integrated can go to the ground and really, you know, do what we need to do. But it's different from assigning the armed forces to command everybody on the domestic policy. So anyhow, I think Brazilians are very excited. At least half of Brazilians are very excited, and I'm hoping that we will have good news to share in a 1 year time and so on.
Thanks, Natalie. I want to summarize this, and I'm going to open some questions to the audience. But first, unfortunately, Assistant Secretary Medina has to leave for her next event. Please join me in thanking her again. So, thank you, Monica. So again, so just to summarize, and again, remember I run a think tank, so I'm always looking for ideas, right? So I think what I heard in terms of bringing folks together, you know, Monica talked about, again, it's about the evidence. She said the security agencies, when they see results, they'll come to the table when they understand the results. Alice talked about kind of, you know, that budget or hard review, when you actually show like who's got a stake in this. In her case, it was defense through their land ownership. Chiz, again, said, you know, you need to understand those security indicators and how do you convey the impact relevant to what they care about. And I think the exciting, again, in terms of exciting for some positive change, we know those impacts are there. It's just not clear that the linkages have been painted. So we know the impacts are there. And Natalie, again, you mentioned as well, the same theme, educating the armed forces, which again is, how do you communicate what the impact is on security and the value of these investments? I wonder, you know, I'm going to pause. I like to go a little bit off script, but I'm just going to pause to do a check-in. Are there questions from the audience at this time? Is there anything anyone wants to interject, a thought, a comment? Please, we can use my microphone here if you want to step forward, or Natalie's, yeah. And just introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Samuel Okulony. I am from Uganda. I work with an NGO. I basically taking interest in your fight in the Amazon basin. You said that there is a lot of destruction going on, and I'm trying to connect with what is happening in our country, especially in the Albertine, where they have discovered oil and gas, but also there is large-scale conversion of forested landscapes, especially for sugarcane growing. And you find most of these developments are protected by the military. What would you recommend? What approaches have you been trying to use in as far as trying to reverse? Because that's what we would want to do, to reverse this massive destruction within our ecosystems in the country.
Want to have more questions?
No, let's take this, yeah.
Thank you very much for the question. I think what I can share about what we did well in Brazil and that we are not doing anymore, and that's the reason why we got to the point where we are at, is that in the past, actually in the 2000s, Brazil invested in three things that resulted in a super good achievement in terms of reducing deforestation and also reducing violence on the ground, and and these were, one, land tenure, so working to really recognize the rights of indigenous peoples, creating protected areas, but also titling as well, private titling in different cases. It's very tough to do. We still have a huge task in that regard, but land tenure is one thing, land governance, by the way. The other, and then specifically recognizing the rights of those who are entitled to, like indigenous peoples. But another thing was that we were able to enforce legislation on environment because we had a very good monitoring system. We have that. We monitor forest cover officially and also independently. So the NGOs in Brazil do the same thing that the government does using satellite images. GEF has been a supporter of that for a long time. We do that since 1988. So we have the whole series. And I'm not paid to say that, but Brazil can export that and actually has worked with other countries, so maybe that's one area. But having the transparency on the deforestation happening on the ground is absolutely critical, because even when you have like a government, a president, like in our case, that goes against the agenda, you see it. The satellite images, they won't lie to you. They will provide the information. So regardless of the political situation, you can see. And then third is really working on the new economy, because you have to divest and you have to control the threats on one side, and you have to invest in alternatives on the other, right? You have to provide people a way out, especially those that are involved in these illegal schemes. They don't want to be in those schemes, right? So the combination of these three things worked in our case, and I believe can work in other countries. And civil society has a super important role in all of this, because the government cannot do it alone. So in all of these 3 points that are that are tools, that are studies, that are calls for action that the civil society can really bring up, and I would really encourage you to continue doing your work and actually reinforce those areas too.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks for that question. It was in fact one of mine, so you stole it. So thank you very much. I'll go to you next, but first I just want to go to Alice. Alice, and just to ask generally, because, and you've touched on some of this, but WWF has been doing a lot of work in the nature security space, and you had this major report with Adelphi, the nature of conflict and peace. So I wonder, either in response to this question or more broadly, as the African Region Director, could you speak about how you're seeing this relationship between nature and security play out across the continent? Is there more you want to say?
Sure, yes, and I think I covered that earlier by saying that, across our continent, the places where we have the biggest conflicts are also the places where we have the biggest natural. So the Congo Basin, your Albertine Rift, of course, is very much an oil space. But the Congo Basin, Lake Chad, the Sahel, so the intersection between nature and conflict is real. And I also talked about the fact that we need better governance, and also we need better partnerships. So far, I think the management of natural resources has traditionally been has been under the government, right? The ministry, whether it's the Protected Area Agency or the Ministry of Environment. But in a case like this, where you have nature and security really intersecting, then you need to bring in your security as well as a partner, so that you can work together and find solutions. And then the issue and communities, of course. And in fact, some of the success stories we have in Africa are really the places where communities have been engaged in managing resources. They are the best. They call them the CBNRM, the community-based natural resource management. All those models where you have created incentives for communities to manage these resources by giving them tenure and allowing them to share in the benefits that come out of these resources. That is where the success has been. So our lesson really has been that you have to bring in communities to manage these resources. You have to give them the incentives that Natalie was talking about, the tenure, but also allow them to benefit. Everywhere where we have that happening, there is success. In fact, I think there's more success than where government is managing these resources. And in many countries, really, government cannot manage the protected area on its own, and that's why they have in the law, I think in the Uganda Wildlife Act, you have 20% of revenue from tourism goes to communities. And in Tanzania, in Kenya, we all have really enshrined in the law community benefits for managing natural resources because of exactly that. I also want to add the point you made about satellite, because I think it's really good, because it's the transparency. You're able to talk about the fact that, look, this has happened because you have data. But also, I think what it also does, it shows you where conservation action is either being successful or is not being successful, and where you need to do some course correction. So that's also extremely important.
Thank you, Alice. I have to say, I don't know if anyone has ever told me in a nicer way. Richard, you already asked me that question.
Okay.
Yeah, I love working with you. She's the best. But I think this point that you raise about supporting communities, right? Who said working in new economies, giving them alternatives?
Yes.
I mean, that's critical. If you're going to force someone to choose between feeding their family and protecting nature, you know what they're going to choose, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. You have to have, they have to have, even for restoration, we're talking about restoration in this workshop, right? We're going to do a lot of massive restoration, but we must build restoration economies.
Yeah.
We have to have, someone's livelihood is so important. There must be a livelihood.
It's fundamental. I think, Natalie, you wanted a quick comment on this one, and then...
Very, very quick comment, but although this is true and we have to make this nature economy thrive for locals and for everybody, there is always a concern that people see like poverty as the driver of nature laws. And I think we have to be very careful with that, because we're talking about criminals here. We are talking about large-scale deforestation, large-scale criminal networks, right? And I think many times we hear, and it was not what you said, but many times we hear that, oh, so poor people will have to get something. If they don't have an alternative, they will, you know, deforest, or they will not protect nature. And it's, we need to flip that narrative, because it's no longer valid, and actually these people are being used by the criminals to you know, to do that, what they want to do. So just a comment.
Thanks. No, that's very helpful. Thanks so much, Natalie. Chiz, do you want to get in on this?
Or do you want to ask another question?
No, it's up to you. Why don't you speak first, then we'll go to the next question.
All right. So yeah, very insightful question. And as Natalie said, and I just wanted to provide in one statistic. In the second half of the 20th century, from 1990 to 2000, apparently up to 80% of all armed conflicts occurred in forested areas or biodiversity hotspots. So there is a pretty good overlap, if you will, of the areas that we're trying to protect from the conservation as well as sustainable development perspectives, as well as the hotspots from the perspective of security, you know, be it national security or global security. And the other layer that I want to overlay on this one is that when you're talking about biodiversity hotspots, we're also talking about vital reserves. These are irreplaceable places on this earth. Amazon being one of them, the Congo Basin being one of them, the Mesoamericas, Indo-Malaya region, what happens in Madagascar, so on and so forth. We as the humanity can't really afford to lose these areas from the perspective of our survival, our humans, right? So way above and beyond the issues we're talking about, the poverty and so on and so forth, I think there's an obligation from the global community to do our best to actually put our resources to protect these places. I mean, mitigating a ton of carbon from my backyard is not at all the same thing as mitigating the ton of carbon from the Amazon, the Congo Basin. It just is not. So there has to be a lot more concerted effort to these areas for conservation, which also happens to be the hotspots of conflict. So something we need to really think about in terms of being able to communicate this, but also to make the propositions, if you will,
to the governments that there are alternatives that the global community are coming together to address from the sustainable development perspective, but it's also going to help you address issues you might be facing or you might end up facing from the national security perspective.
Thanks, Chiz. Look, I see people furiously writing that down. I just wanted to say, because I think that summarizes it perfectly,
Yeah.
right? We started that by saying that nature is the foundation for human security. And we have these hotspots that you said are really where most of the conflict is.
Absolutely.
Right? We have to act. Sorry, yeah, please, Alice.
No, I was going to add just one point on really what she has said, that when the Congo Basin absorbing 1.2 trillion tons of carbon a year, that's a global public good. It's not just for the people in that region. It is a global public, which means I think we need everybody, as Shiza said, everybody should care about the Amazon and the Congo Basin. These are global public goods because they are doing they're global solutions to climate change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I made you wait a long time, but here I'll hand you a microphone, please, and just introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Edwin Mombere. I'm from Uganda. I work with a NGO in Uganda. My question goes to Alice. We are having a challenge between Uganda and DRC because we are realizing there are a lot of illegal wildlife trade from the animal products and then the redwood that is most wanted. And this is being aided by the security forces, the military, and then it also goes back to the community that helps in the hunting of the wild animals. I would like to know if WWF has tried to engage the security forces in the two countries, and if yes, to what extent has the community also been involved in this kind of thing? Because at the end of the day, we are affected, and on the other hand, the community is also involved in this kind of thing. So I wanted to know WWF's stand on that. Thank you.
Oh wow, that's a tough one, isn't it? So yeah, and it's very much related to what we are discussing here today, isn't it? It's the resources are transboundary, they are shared. The governance, the DRC is a fragile state. Uganda and Rwanda, that's where really the border is, have probably slightly better managed, and then that is the weakest link. Yeah, the DRC side is the weakest link, and I think for me, we have a program in WWF called the Greater Virunga Landscape, and it's actually trying to tackle this particular issue. Because what has always been our challenge has been that in Uganda and Rwanda, we've managed to put in place these laws and we've managed to put in place these regulations, but we still have to get the DRC to come along, and it's always tricky, and it's very comes to the heart of what we're discussing today, where you have a very important biodiversity hotspot and very weak governance and a very fragile state. And one of and Natalie mentioned earlier poverty, the poverty angle, but what we've found also is when you don't have the regulations that allow communities that live nearest to the resources to benefit from the resources, they are the ones that are going to be targeted by the poachers. They're the ones that are going to be targeted by criminal activity because that's where the incentive is coming from. So we need to work with communities. One of the most successful programs we have, which is very near there, is the GEF-funded Bwindi Mgahinga Trust Fund. And there, really the success at the end of the day, why do we have gorillas increasing from 480 in 2010 to 1,000 today? It's all about the communities. It is the moment we started working with communities and entering into these benefit sharing agreements, dealing with human-wildlife conflict, building schools, hospitals. This was the first time we had conservation funding doing that. And that has been the success story. It is not just only anti-poaching. Yes, of course, that's important. The conservation management is important, but it's really the communities. So for me, I think that, and for WWF, to answer your question, our focus is on working with the communities. It's on empowering the communities to have the voice, to better manage those resources, and really be supported to work closely with governments. Thanks.
You know, it's maybe a risk as we're nearing the end of the panel to open up a new topic, but I feel like before we go, I want to see if we could get your quick thoughts on the impacts from a gender perspective, specifically on women. The reason I ask this is because we know from our work in adaptation that climate change has a disproportionate impact on women. We've also seen that in biodiversity. So for example, examples where we've had fish stocks decline means there's more competition in the fishery, women get pushed out of it where they've had traditional roles, sometimes there's increases in sexual violence. I wondered if I could, this connection between nature and security, any comments on kind of gender, specifically women, that you might want to add to the conversation? Chiz?
I'll just mention one thing. It's the issue of land tenure. Somebody raised it. Who was it? You? So in terms of land tenure and rights to their own lands, we know we have issues because that's one of the drivers, if you will, of illegal activities and the communities and people being pushed out. If you look at across the world, the land tenure issue, women are the ones that are really being punished here. You know, your husband might die, right? Is the land going to come to you? In many parts of the world, women have no rights to own land. Okay, so this let me just put one thing out there, that if you're talking about empowering the communities and local indigenous peoples to have some level of engagement, meaningful engagement, as well as voices in the way to move forward, this particular issue of land tenure and women's right is extremely important. Thanks.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I don't know if I could add better. I mean, other than telling you that women are Mother Nature, right? They are the custodians of these resources. They are the ones that look after them, and they are the ones that suffer when they are depleted. They are the ones that walk long distances to look for water. They are the ones that walk long distances to look for food. Women are extremely important player here, and they must be front and center in what we do.
I don't have much to add, but yeah, Mother Nature
hard to
needs
go
her
third
daughters,
after,
right? So we really need to support it. But great question, and I think the importance of raising this in the context of nature and security nexus is absolutely critical. So thank you for raising this.
Yeah, thanks for that. Because you know, the differential impacts that Alice, we've seen that deeply in our work in the NAP Global Network, the National Adaptation Planning Network. The land titles, Chiz, I admit I haven't thought about that as much, but that's absolutely central. So thanks for that. Let me go again to the audience. I see a hand up here.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Iwerks. I'm with the Legal Empowerment Network, and we work with thousands of land and environmental justice defenders around the world. And so my question for you is one more about solution than about framing, right? So if security is the framing, but you've said that the solution to nature preservation is a lot about working with communities, what does it look like for each of your organizations to double down on that? To be supporting communities, to making sure they're getting the resources and the security within their community to be able to do the work that they're doing going forward?
Oh, I almost planted that question because I was thinking that would be such a great way to end, because we do have some examples where we're seeing the security benefits of nature-based investment. I know we want to talk about that. So yeah, if we could each speak to some of the examples, and Alice, if I asked you that before, I apologize.
Oh, I don't know. You did not. But we should, let's talk about security. What does it mean? Human security. For me to be able to walk out and have land tenure and find the food and the water and everything, that is security. Yeah, we're not just talking about military security, we're talking about human security and national security. So for me, security is about that. That would be the way I would frame it, is that this is not just about nature, it's also about human security. And that's really, security is bigger than just military, it's also about that. Yeah.
So you asked for an example. One good example that we started fairly recently is called Inclusive Conservation Initiative. So typically, for most institutions that GF would work with, it would go through, if you will, the UN agencies, the MDBs, or big NGOs like IUCN, WWF, right? And eventually it would work with the governments. So we decided that there has to be an alternative to this narrative, right? So through an inclusive conservation initiative, we decided that 80% of the resources we would allocate should be programmed, decided, and implemented by indigenous communities, indigenous populations. And we think really empowering them to make their own decisions, but to be responsible, if you will, for the land stewardship as well as conservation stewardship, empowering them with the actual resources to them to do so, for both implementation but also in the decision making. We thought this was quite important. So sort of getting some early lessons back to us, but we're committed to actually upscale this in the current GF period, which is started in July for the next 4-year period. So hopefully we can even share some early example when we go to Montreal in COP15. So
I'll try to be very brief, but I really liked the concept that you brought in earlier about peace multipliers. I really love that notion, and I think it's really working on that. And you asked it about solutions, and the one that comes to my mind is empowering and supporting the voices of the indigenous peoples to get louder and to be heard. And what we've been supporting in Brazil is particularly indigenous peoples in politics, because we had one indigenous congresswoman in this legislature, and she did a wonderful job. If it was her work that impeded a lot of the rollbacks, that impeded that the Indigenous Peoples Agency was moved under the Ministry of Agriculture, that put the Supreme Court to try to remove the invaders, 25,000 invaders of one indigenous land that are after gold mining. So one person can do that. So we just had elections, and there were 100 and something indigenous candidates that were supported. 2 were elected. Okay, 2 out of 100 seems nothing. No, it's already like doubling the effort. You know, 2 indigenous women that are going to be there. So I think it also I think goes through that direction. The political dimension of all of this that we are talking about has to be recognized and really elevated. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Any other questions from the audience? One more, please. This might be our last one, I think.
Thank you. My name is Rehema from Tanzania. I have I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I really like the idea of early warning preparedness or alert. Okay. The thing is, in most cases, like these global programs, they come at the global level, at the national level. Okay. And it's a good thing that if we're going to have like army, like hospitals and the arms involved in it, okay? But my worries, we have these like I call them like most vulnerable groups in our communities. Like I work with girls and women with disability. You know, with them, these programs or these projects, you find like they really don't they don't access them like that easy. Like when there is natural calamities, you'll find someone can't walk, for example. You see, getting out of their house is an issue. So I think at a global level, it's good also to consider these issues at the beginning or at the early stages. Thank you.
Fully agreed. Any reaction to that? No? Yeah.
Fully agree. We fully agree. We have to, women, when we talk about empowering the most vulnerable people, the indigenous people, we're also talking about women and children with disabilities. It's extremely important.
Well, look, in closing, I get to do some thanks. Sorry, was there one more question or no? Yeah, fantastic. Thank you all. Boy, it's hard to thank everyone, but thanks to the GEF and GCF again for hosting us here. Chiz, Alice, Natalie, thank you so much. I really feel like we advanced the conversation. I learned a lot today, so thank you for it. Thank you. I don't think we mentioned up front that I mentioned my organization, ISD, but we're working the full partner in this is the Center for American Progress. Lee Scout is here. Ann Hamill is here, Director of our Resilience program at ISD that's heavily leading this. So we're happy to take any questions and follow up. what we're talking about out of all of this is we want to move this conversation awareness of this issue forward. So we've talked with Deputy Secretary Amina Mohammed and others about potentially launching something like a global commission on nature security to be able to elevate this conversation, raise awareness, to talk about those metrics and measures and elevate the need for investment. We've had some initial funding from the Rockefeller Foundation that CAP and ISD have been doing some of that work on. And now we're talking to various countries and others about how to advance it. So expect to hear more. If any of you are at COP15, we'll also be there again. And actually having a panel with some security folks from the security sector, I think, which will be very helpful to get that perspective. So look, that was a very long ending thank you and a commercial. But thank you all for being here and for your dedication to this important concept of nature as the foundation for human, national, and global security. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.